Welcome to our latest podcast episode. Today, as I set up here, excuse the makeshift studio, we're joined by Professor Alan Lester, who will take us through the entangled histories and modern controversies surrounding British colonialism, as discussed in the book he's edited, The Truth About Empire, Real Histories of British Colonialism. This episode delves into how historical narratives have been shaped by culture wars, the impact of such histories on current politics, and the crucial role of diverse perspectives in understanding our past. Now, let's dive further into this complex topic and learn more from Professor
Alan Lester. I'm a Professor of Historical Geography at the University of Sussex in the UK and Adjunct Professor of History at the Trobe University in Australia. And I think we're going to be talking a bit about a book that's coming out soon and that I edited called The Truth About Empire, Real Histories of British Colonialism. And I've edited it and written an introduction, but it's really a collective endeavour between 14 historians and myself, and with a foreword written by Satnam Sanghera, who will probably be known, his work will be well known to many of you. And it's essentially, it arises out of a bit of a sense of exasperation and frustration among a number of my colleagues who have for a long time been dedicated to trying to understand the colonial past. That's what we do for a living. Work in archives, we try and use the original primary sources, we try and piece together what happened and to interpret it from a variety of different perspectives. And to find that our field of inquiry, our sort of expertise, has been so distorted and manipulated in the current culture war. And it's become a kind of political battlefield in which sometimes quite sinister, quite sort of pernicious misrepresentations of the colonial past are being circulated. And above all, I think in some quarters we've seen an attempt to re-justify, re-legitimate acts of colonial violence and the racist rule that came along with colonialism to serve current political purposes. So this is a group of us getting together to write the truth as far as we can ascertain it. And that's always going to be room for debate around that, and we'll no doubt come to that shortly. But as far as professional academics who've specialised in this throughout their whole career, as far as we can, to tell the truth about what happened in the British Empire.
No, thank you for that. You mentioned that you were a professor of historical geography. For those listening, what does that mean? Because, like, for argument's sake, I did a history degree, and we always took the mick out of people who did a geography degree because we were kind of like, well, you paid to go to university to colour in books, like, ooh, wee. And equally, they would rib the geography department or rib people from history department. But what is going on there for those listening?
Yeah, that's right. Us geographers, we just coloured in maps for our degree, whereas
it's all about the rivers.
You just listed dates. It's maps. But no, I mean, I think you had Stephen Legg on recently, who's also Professor of Historical Geography at Nottingham. We come from a sort of similar academic trajectory, I guess. We were both interested all along in both history and geography. And to me, it's a real shame that certainly my kids, I don't know how prevalent this is in schools still, had to choose between geography or history. They were in these different sort of clusters of subjects that you could pick at GCSE level. And it was similarly for me. I had to make a choice between the two subjects. And it came down to something as simple as when I did A-level, my geography teacher was a better teacher in my eyes than the history teacher. And, the history teacher was someone who later got sacked for inappropriate behaviour. It was something like that put me off.
Fair.
Doing history for A-level. And sort of once I was on that path, same as Steve Legg, actually, I ended up doing geography at Cambridge, but was really pleased that the department at that time had a number of historical geographers in it who were effectively teaching history, but with this kind of geographical awareness. And to me, it was a kind of perfect conjunction between the two disciplines. And ever since, I've been primarily interested in understanding British colonialism. That's my kind of research question, really, is how and why did British colonialism take the form that it did in different sites across the empire? But I've always been fascinated in the connections between those sites. And I think actually that historians who ignore the fact that each individual colony and Britain itself was always kind of co-constituted by these networks the people, material, ideas, commodities, capital, all circulated across these very different places, but mutually constituted each of them, shaped each of them at the same time. That's how my kind of geographical background has been brought to bear in my historical work. And it's one of the reasons why I try to think holistically about the empire as a whole in all its diversity.
That is fascinating, and it's opened a whole can of worms that I'm like, my mind's thinking of all these different questions to ask, but that would be a whole different podcast to the one intended. And it's really interesting because you're right, like GCSE at A-level, and then when I did my degree, it was a straight history degree. You have to pick between the two, and obviously, it's actually funny that you mentioned that your geography teacher was better than your history teacher, because it was the other way around for me. My history teacher just happened to be more just engaging, and just the way that the subject was taught just kind of caught your attention far more. You mentioned earlier that the book is a product to some degree of frustration of yourself and other colleagues at kind of the state of this really annoying, irritating culture war. Everyone listening kind of knows what we're talking about, but do you mind just providing a couple of examples, or one or two that really kind of irked you or caught your attention, or kind of things that you were like, you know what, I think this is just a little bit too far?
Yeah, I mean, I think to set the sort of context a little bit, it was really the Black Lives Matter movement and the kind of backlash against that brought my attention to the way in which history was being kind of re-politicised. So, throughout my career, the history of the British Empire has continually been revised, as historians always do. They always look at particular topics and think of new questions to ask of the sources, and they also find new sources. And one of the big changes that was occurring in colonial and imperial history was the inclusion of different perspectives. So, traditionally, imperial history was taught by white British men about white British men. Ever since the sort of 1880s, when it first started to be taught as a sub-discipline in its own right, after a book by Seeley called The Expansion of England, it was about how white British men had come to rule such a vast swathe of the world, the particular genius, as it was taught, that enabled them to do that, and the way in which they administered and managed this enormous entity for the benefit of the rest of mankind. That was the kind of dominant way in which imperial history was both written and taught. Now, that had been changing for the last sort of 30, 40, 50 years, with different influences coming into play, partly connected with scholars of colour coming into the academy. So some of the first post-colonial scholars, people like Gayatri Spivak and Homi Bhabha and Edward Said, didn't come from these kind of white establishment backgrounds. So they came from the colonised parts of the world, with a whole set of very different perspectives. And their work, very gradually, against much resistance, was changing the way that colonial and imperial history was taught. And as well as people of colour coming into the academy and the experiences of people of colour being seen as relevant, for almost the first time, we also had a lot more women coming into the academy, and women interested in the experiences of women in empire, and trying to sort of find their way around sources that simply didn't feature women's perspectives, to try and build in, half the world's population's experience of empire. And all these things were progressively changing the discipline, enabling us to see more of the past, rather than just to see it through a narrow kind of white particularist lens. And I think when Black Lives Matter occurred, it wasn't the beginning of a backlash. There had already been, a backlash against some of this opening up of perspectives. But certainly to do with activism, that's when you saw a mainstreaming of the kind of denial and the urge to resist and turn back some of these progressive changes in the academy. I think actually before Black Lives Matter, it's probably the Rhodes Must Fall movement was one of the trigger points. So this debate, which began at the University of Cape Town when anti-racist students pulled down, the statue of Cecil Rhodes, this arch imperialist and exploiter of African people and lands, at the University of Cape Town. And then there's the kind of component movement to remove the statue of Rhodes above Oriel College in Oxford. And that's when we saw really the beginnings of a kind of re-justification of what Rhodes had done. So some of the more right-wing conservative people who waded into this debate, some of them academics, many of them journalists, many of them politicians, they saw this as a kind of a moment of crystallization. And I think what they felt was if we don't stand up and resist these tendencies to revisionism of our history, of our national story now, then it's going to be too late. So after Rhodes Must Fall 2015, 2016, you started to see in the popular media a return to some of the justifications for the violent conquest of other places and other peoples that people like Rhodes had conducted, and a return to the justifications that they had put out at the time for their actions, that these people needed benevolent white British rule to develop themselves, that they were sunk in barbarism and primitivism and until we came along and saved them. All the stuff that Rhodes and people like him were saying at the time. Suddenly started to see it again in the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, later on GBTV. And Black Lives Matter in June 2020, when Colston's statue was toppled, brought slavery in particular to the forefront of these debates. And again, it's a similar story. We'd seen a kind of an opening up of historical research on slavery with all kinds of new data sources available. The Legacies of British Slavery Centre at UCL did this fantastic project of making available the records of who had owned enslaved people and who had been paid compensation for them when slavery was abolished in 1834. And there was all sorts of work going on about just how deeply penetrative of British society slave ownership was, how sort of constitutive it was of British society. And then you had databases like the Transatlantic Slave Trade database looking at ships, transatlantic slaving ships, which is opening up the scale of the transatlantic trade. So all this great work was going on. And once Colston's statue became a focal point for anti-racist activity, all of a sudden it became an urgent necessity for right-wing politicians and supporters in the media to start to backtrack and say, well, we should think about anti-slavery, not slavery, and to try to deny and disavow, title of another book of mine actually, deny and disavow aspects of Britain's role in the slave trade and to deflect attention away from it towards the things that patriotic white Britons should be celebrating. And I think that was a moment in which public discourse was really heavily politicised around empire, and that's what spurred me to think about this book.
I do remember seeing in the media where there was a point where it was laying more emphasis on how Britain played a role in stopping slavery rather than actually looking at the whole image and looking at actually, well, hold on, prior to that, they were involved in all sorts of other activities, including slavery, obviously. One thing that I wanted to ask you, and it ties into obviously what we're discussing, which is how does Brexit fit into all of this? Because I think what was interesting is the other day, I'm sure you've seen it all over Twitter, which is Defiance on Channel 4. And I was just looking, there's a chap that comes on from the National Front. I can't remember the guy's name now, but he looks really similar to a Conservative politician at the moment. So I was just digging into seeing if they were actually related, and they're not. But what I was led to was a photo of them, the National Front back in the 70s, they asking essentially to leave the European Union, to leave the free market, which made me just kind of puzzled me slightly because I didn't realize it was something that politicians had been asking for however long. And then it made me question more so how Brexit was utilised by the right wing and people like Nigel Farage and the Conservatives. However, I really want to ask you that question because, as in, you'll be able to give me a far more contextualised answer.
Yeah, I mean, the debate to which Empire Mark II was driving the pro-Brexit campaign, there is a debate about that. I think it is possible to kind of overemphasise how much imperial nostalgia, the role of imperial nostalgia in Brexit, the Brexit vote. As you say, there'd been a long Eurosceptic tradition on the right of British politics, also on the left, to be fair, which saw British exceptionalism as the sort of anchor point for British identity. The British were exceptional not only in maintaining the world's largest ever empire, but also in kind of distancing ourselves from continental Europe. And in fact, during the second half of the 19th century, most sort of historians of Britain look at how the two were reciprocal. So maintaining a certain distance and allowing a certain balance of power to play out in Europe without getting too heavily involved in the second half of the 19th century gave Britain the possibility to colonise other parts of the world, left pretty much to their own devices. So I think there is an element within pro-Brexit thought, which is about British exceptionalism, that we can do without those continental neighbours, and we can resurrect our former global predominance without the sort of hindrance of Europe through these kind of neo-colonial ties. But I think there was also an awful lot more about Brexit that was short-term. It was about free movement of people across European boundaries, and it was about post-2008 banking crisis, global financial crisis, and whether you move to the left or to the right once you're disillusioned with liberalism. So there's all these sorts of contingencies going on. But certainly that kind of imperial nostalgia was played upon by some Brexiteers, not least Boris Johnson, and this idea of resurrecting some of Britain's global dominance without the hindrance of Europe. Yeah.
No, thank you for that. Just then, obviously, coming back to the book, although I guess all of this is connected because Brexit didn't happen in a vacuum. I guess for people on the right or others who would read the book and go, well, hold on, this is just a bunch of lefty historians who are putting their bias or their view of history forward, how would you answer the way historians deal with sources and ensure, because I was reading obviously your chapter that you've written and I thought it was very succinctly put how individual bias is always going to be there and we need to be aware of that, and you can never technically kind of step out of it, but that doesn't mean that we still can't make certain conclusions and certain judgments based on those sources.
Yeah. I mean, there is a trap which is sort of set for you whenever you try to intervene against some of the extreme right-wing narratives. And that trap is, well, you're just as politicised as we are. It's just that you're on the left and we're on the right. So to give you an example, I wrote a critique of probably the most sort of comprehensive statement of this right-wing attempt to re-justify empire. It's a book by Nigel Biggar, who was a retired professor of theology from Oxford. And he was one of the first to wade in defence of Cecil Rhodes's statue. So, right from the beginning of this kind of culture war over empire, he's been an outspoken proponent of the kind of right-wing neoconservative view, often platformed in the Daily Telegraph, connections to all sorts of political movements. And he wrote this book called Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning, which is the sort of longest and most detailed attempt to re-justify the morality of empire, to basically argue that empire did more good than it did harm. And in reviewing that book in some detail, I found numerous instances in which the evidence had been distorted, and I can come and say a bit more about that in the future. And certain sources either entirely ignored, historians' work ignored, or twisted to take on meanings that they never actually intended in the first place. So writing this long critique, I kind of anticipated that one of the objections would be, well, you're a left-wing, foaming at the mouth radical, that's the only reason you're taking me on, that you're no better and no more objective than I am. So I actually sort of set out my political credentials, which are, reasonably sort of moderate, really. I've never been an activist or anything right at the start to try and deflect that. It did no blooming good. Still got you're foaming at the mouth, left-wing radical kind of thing. But I think there's a few things that I can say in response to that. First of all, I've been doing this stuff for 30 years, led by curiosity. And many of the people who I get exasperated about have never researched British colonialism. Mm-hmm. They've only come to it because of politics. Because they don't want Cecil Rhodes's statue taken down, or because they're appalled that Edward Colston's statue was thrown in Bristol Harbour. All of a sudden they become experts in colonialism, and they can tell us all how these men had benevolent effects, or Britain was responsible only for anti-slavery, and we should forget about the slavery. So one thing is just sheer accumulated knowledge and expertise that's come out of doing my job for the last 30 years. And for most of those 30 years, there wasn't this culture war over empire. What I wrote was still critical of empire. It was critical of the violent appropriation of other people's lands, and it pointed the racial hierarchies that operated in every colony. But it wasn't pitched against any particular political party or political position today. It was just writing about history because that's what I do. So that's one thing. But the other thing I think that is tricky to navigate here is that you're accused of being inclined towards progressive politics simply because, as an historian, you want a more holistic view of empire. So it comes back to what I was saying earlier, that if you're interested in colonialism as a phenomenon, rather than, say, being interested in justifying white supremacy, then you will be interested in any experience or perspective on colonialism. You'll be interested in what women experienced in colonialism. You'll be interested in what Aboriginal Australian people experienced. You'll be interested in Sikh, Hindu, Muslim experiences of empire in India. And you'll be open to all of these perspectives, and you'll want more people from these kinds of backgrounds in the academy, bringing different perspectives, bringing different interests, different research questions to the sources. So you will want to open up your perspective on empire. But that very act in itself is seen as an act of progressive politics, by those who are of a more sort of conservative disposition. So just by opening yourself to all the sources that are available, you inevitably become identified with a kind of leftist political position. And I know conservative with a small c, conservative historians of colonialism, who don't let their findings be distorted so patently in the way that some right-wing commentators are. So, when they wouldn't write a book like Nigel Biggers, for instance, because they're writing it from the perspective of an historian who might interpret certain activities in a small c conservative way, but wouldn't drive a whole narrative intended right from the very start to justify the actions of any one group or another. It's more about understanding the interactions between those groups. And I think all we could do is just keep repeating those differences between us and overtly politicised commentators. And I just in the interest of balance, I have to say that one can say the same thing about some activists on the left, that they will only revisit history for the purpose of decrying how racist and how violent it was. I tend to have more sympathy for them because it was racist and it was violent, but doing that to the utter exclusion of other factors that the right tends to draw attention to, like the degree of collaboration, the degree of cooperation, the degree of mutual benefit among some groups. Certainly not all groups, but some colonised groups found benefit in liaising with the British. If we look just at the racism and the violence and we ignore those aspects which enabled the empire to sustain itself for so long, that collaboration, that limited degree of consent, then we're doing almost an equal injustice to a full appreciation of history. But it does tend to be mainly from the right rather than the left, I think. This very partial view at the moment. No,
I wouldn't disagree. Considering the complexities of empire and the sheer size of it and the number of years it lasted and the different kind of machinations that it appears sometimes within the same country, and kind of it changes perhaps over time, like for India, for argument's sake, with the mutiny, the form of governance changes almost overnight, and equally the white dominions are treated completely different in the long run to, say, how Africa's treated. With all of that complexity leading obviously then to obstacles when it comes to research, how do historians of empire overcome those obstacles? Because equally in the chapter that I wrote, in the chapter I read that you had written, if only I had written something so good. In that chapter that I read, you had spoken about how essentially about the obstacles of finding, of actually not even getting the source itself, but actually the fact that the source may probably not have been written, considering the voice you want to hear actually isn't in the record. So how do you go about finding the records that do exist? And then secondly, how do you go about filling in those gaps? Because I guess to some degree the historians are voice for the voiceless, but how much, what goes into creating that voice or figuring out what that voice is?
Yeah, it's really tricky, and there is no satisfactory solution to this. You're constantly sort of struggling with it, which again opens you up to critique from various quarters, because we are reliant on historical evidence, but we also have to have a very healthy skepticism of that evidence. Not only what is there, whose perspective it's written from, but also what isn't there. The gaps in that record. So most famously, I guess one of the reasons why, when I sort of spoke through that rapid history of how history writing, the historiography has changed, and I talked about the influence of post-colonialism, overturning some of or at least challenging some of the white-centered narratives before. One of the most famous contributors to that was an essay by Gayatri Spivak, Can the Subaltern Speak? And it addresses this point of yours that the vast majority of people in human history as a whole, and also in colonial imperial history, have been illiterate. They haven't written down their observations and their findings. So how does one recover their experiences, their agency in a way? And Spivak used the example of sati in India, a Hindu practice of a widow throwing herself on the funeral pyre, and said that there's two dominant narratives. There's the British white colonial official who claimed the credit for abolishing sati, and forget about the fact that various Indian reformers had suggested it be abolished for a very long time. And who write about it as an instance of Indian barbarism and savagery, which the civilised British are there to put down. And then you've got sort of Indian nationalist men writing about it as an instance of a sort of proud indigenous tradition that is upheld in the face of this British interference. But the voices of the women who are expected to engage in the act themselves are just sort of absent from the archive. So, it prompts this whole series of further questions about how you represent a phenomenon like that when, the majority of people's perspectives on it simply aren't there. And historians try and find various ways around that. None of them satisfactory, but the best we can do, basically. One of them is to read what is there against the grain. From Anne-Laure Stoller, historical anthropologists use this term. So you read the records of colonial officials or missionaries, for instance, but you read it with a kind of very sceptical eye, thinking about the circumstances around them and the way that they're describing them in a particular way, but how others engaged in those circumstances might understand them. So, to give a trite example, if a local district official writes about the natives being restless because they weren't happy with their pay for doing some kind of local work, rather than just seeing it as a result of natives always being restless, that's just in their character, which is the way that official might have written it. You think about, well, what were their conditions of work? Were they forced to work? Were they coerced to work for less wages than a white person would have been always the case? And you start to sort of fill in the gaps in that way. But the other way of doing it is where you can, and again, doesn't always work, is to use oral traditions and oral sources and try to triangulate them where you can with written sources. And to give you one example of something that's doing this very successfully, which is mentioned in the book, the Truth About Empire book, there's a chapter by Lyndall Ryan, who is an Australian historian. And Australian historians went through something like the culture war that we're going through now in Britain about sort of 20 years ago, called the History Wars in Australia. So after the bicentenary of celebrating Captain Cook's arrival, or the First Fleet's arrival rather, there was a big outcry in Australia about historians representing British colonisation as an episode of violent dispossession, the killing and the destruction of Aboriginal people. And again, there was a right-wing backlash against that. A right-wing government, a number of right-wing commentators, journalists called Keith Winshuttle, started to say that this was just a bunch of leftist academics, that the colonisation of Australia was largely non-violent, that it was unintentional spread of disease, not killing, that had eradicated Aboriginal cultures in different parts of the continent. And Lyndall Ryan was in the firing line because she'd written about acts of violence in Tasmania. often thought of as the most clear-cut example of a genocide in the British Empire. And she'd written about a number of massacres in Tasmania. And she was picked upon and pulled apart by people interrogating her sources and casting doubt on each individual source, saying, well, this person may have got it wrong, this person couldn't be trusted for this reason or that reason, and cumulatively trying to cast doubt on her work. So rather than sort of giving up or receding from the scene, Linda Ryan went back and got some research funding to do the work on colonial massacres even more thoroughly, using oral histories. Because Aboriginal communities know where massacres took place. It's passed down from generation to generation. The massacre of a whole group of people is not something that's easily forgotten in a community. So using oral testimony, and then the oral testimony in turn gave rise to uncovering new documentary sources that hadn't been consulted before, ones that even traditional historians would see as more trustworthy than oral tradition. So local newspaper reports, local magistrates' reports that witnesses had said that these things happened, that they'd just been ignored, and written out of the history. So by putting the two together, these kind of oral sources, oral testimony, local oral testimony, and new documentary sources, she's been able to produce this colonial massacres map, which you can Google or whatever, look up online, with a fantastic amount of detailed evidence about hundreds and hundreds of massacres that can now be proven to have taken place across the whole of Australia. And it's sort of one in the face for the deniers, basically. But it took that enormous amount of creative and enterprising work with local communities. That's incredibly important here, to uncover those traditions and to link them into the kind of more formal historical analysis.
I love the fact that she was able to combine oral sources, and then that led to the written sources, and then she was able to kind of merge them together because, that's brilliant. I remember some of the essays we had to cover at university were basically seeing whether oral sources, the debate was, can oral sources kind of be trusted? And it's brilliant to see that actually they can, and they can lead to all sorts of brilliant outcomes, which is amazing to hear.
Yeah.
Talking of controversial topics such as genocide and massacres, how important is it for historians, especially historians of empire, to continue to engage with topics that people may deem controversial or difficult, or whatever the words may be that people may wish to use to kind of, I guess, direct you to not look at certain things or to look at certain things? How important do you think it is for us to, as historians, continue to do that?
Yeah, I think it is incredibly important for us to continue and not to be deterred from investigating topics because they are controversial. Otherwise, we do get these kind of partisan and sanitized views of history, like those that many on the right are trying to salvage, the sort of traditional imperial histories of the British Empire. But I think where we do investigate these highly controversial issues, it is incumbent on us to do it sort of professionally and with sensitivity to those involved on all sides. I think one of the sort of main things that historians have to have in their toolkit is an ability to develop a degree of empathy with people on all sides of, often very violent, very nasty interactions, because you don't get inside the head enough to understand, such actions. And to be able to see the world through someone else's worldview, if you don't have some kind of ability to connect with their emotional state, their feelings, and so on. And I guess some of the most controversial work on this has been trying to understand things like the Holocaust and the Second World War from the perspective of those Nazis who carried out these acts, which are seemingly simply incomprehensible. But unless historians do try to understand where that is coming from, which involves a degree of empathy, obviously with very strict limits around it, but to understand why Nazis acted in the way they did, then we're no further forward in trying to see the signs of something like this happening again, and trying to take what preventative actions historians can urge others to take. So it involves a great degree of sensitivity and very careful use of words as well to express, the extent to which we try to understand actions without sympathising or identifying with those who are doing it, but with the ability to empathise enough to understand why they're doing what they're doing. So, and you can see from the I'm sort of trying to guard my language now how controversial it can be and how it can land you in deep trouble if slight excerpts are so a lot of historians are afraid of doing that kind of thing, particularly in terms of public engagement. I think that the second thing is we need to be aware of how sources of evidence change through a particularly controversial episode and become available afterwards too. So sometimes commenting too early is a trap that one can fall into. I'll give you an example that when the wars of decolonisation were taking place, 1950s, 1960s wars in Kenya, in Aden, and Malaya and so on, those emergencies as the British government called them, the sources weren't readily available for many historians to realise just how connected and how violent Britain's attempt to hang on to empire was. And sometimes new sources get revealed sort of unexpectedly. So with the Mau Mau legal case, for instance, when Mau Mau veterans mobilised to try and get compensation for the torture that they'd been subjected to by British forces in Kenya during the 1950s, that new sources were revealed, and a whole hidden archive was revealed at Hanslope Park through the work of three historians, David Anderson, Hugh Bennett and Caroline Elkins. Through their work with Mau Mau veterans, historians were able to see a whole set of new sources that cast new light on a controversial episode, which they wouldn't have had access to at the time. So I think there's all sorts of safeguards around you as you try to engage with controversial topics, and you have to be very well aware of them and tread very carefully. But it's essential that that work is done. To the extent that history is about learning lessons from the past, you're not going to learn any unless you do try to get to grips with these topics from all angles.
I guess, I completely understand where you're coming from, but then at the same time, the skeptic in me is kind of like, well, numerous genocides have occurred since the Holocaust, and there is lots and lots of scholarship on the Holocaust, on the Rwandan genocide, on all sorts of genocides that have taken place since, and we're currently witnessing a genocide occurring in Palestine. The scholarship doesn't, to some degree, it almost feels as though no matter what historians say or what anyone says, it's almost, you're just shouting in the wind, because when governments or nations want to do whatever they want to do, they kind of just get on with it. So I guess, how much does the scholarship matter or influence the outcomes, I guess? It is important, obviously, in order for the general, I guess, just for the sake of truth, but I guess in relation to outcomes of events, how much can it influence or kind of help and negate something occurring again?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And, where I think we have a much more indirect, and I hope at least, this is my sort of glimmer of hope, and some kind of influence is in public understandings of history, which in turn can produce different political scenarios in the future. Constantly disappointed in the outcomes, but still constantly hopeful. And what, for example, I talked earlier about the history wars in Australia. And I think pretty much now those history wars have been won by historians consistently, painstakingly working with Aboriginal groups and increasingly Aboriginal historians too in the public domain, just confronting Australian mainstream media with the fact that the colonisation of Australia was violent, it was brutal, it wasn't just about unintentional disease, that there were these massacres. And it's become more and more rare for deniers in Australia to get away with their denials. It doesn't necessarily lead to a more sort of progressive political outcome for Aboriginal people. We saw recently in a referendum on recognising Aboriginal people with a treaty and a voice in Parliament that it very narrowly swung against that representation, partly through the manipulation of social media, which is becoming a well-recognised tool of right-wing groups around the world at the last minute to sway that vote. So it doesn't always work, but you hope that through this sort of painstaking repetition of historical accuracy, historical truth, as far as we can get at it, that populations in democracies sway their governments more at some point to take certain actions rather than others. But as you say, it's disillusioning at times, and all you can do is do your best.
Yeah, no, definitely. Discussing kind of impact and relevance, what impact are you hoping that the book has on, I guess, just the general debate, but also educational approaches to how the general populace views or engages with empire?
Yeah, I mean, I think one lesson I'd sort of like to get across in the book is that although it's called, the truth about empire, as if the truth is something definitive and fixed, the key lesson when you come to read it really is that the truth about the colonial past will continue to look different, to take different shape as new evidence is found and as new questions are asked of the past. So trying to fix a certain narrative as the definitive one that can no longer be challenged, that we can't go back on, something which Kemi Badenoch spoke about recently. She's had a go at historians for continually wanting to revise history as if we've got it now, we've got the fixed narrative, we've just got to preserve that. Trying to do that, as much of the right-wing media and key government figures in this country have been doing in the culture war, is a pernicious and a wholly political exercise. It has nothing to do with our understanding of the past. So in some ways, the past is as lively as the present. It's not something that's gone and lost. And we need to continue engaging with it sort of thoughtfully and honestly and diligently to shed light on how we came to be where we are. And we need to continue to cultivate this sort of insight and a degree of empathy that enables understanding, at least, with all of its diverse actors. If we're going to understand these current trajectories of conflict and think about reconciliation. I guess the second point is that the ways some politicians want to have British history taught, I think, is very different from their approach to the way they're happy to see the history of other parts of the world taught. It's almost as if a critical approach to certain kings and queens in English history is fine, but a critical approach to Britain's engagement with the wider world, especially through colonialism, that has to be kind of hived off from the rest of the curriculum. That's just a place where you learn about patriotic pride rather than about understanding of the past. And I think, if we can't have a critical approach to our colonial past, their view is that developing such a critical approach to the colonial past undermines national cohesion. You see this again and again, that if we talk about racial divisions, about white supremacy in empire, we're somehow undermining national cohesion today. Well, I think that's complete nonsense. We can teach Britain's colonial past in a more holistic and a more honest way without undermining any sense of shared national endeavour in the present. In fact, I think they're trying to preserve the justifications that white men produce for conquering and ruling over black people. That's one of the main obstacles to national cohesion. And we're a multiracial nation as a result of empire. And to keep teaching our history as if only white people's views of empire matter, I think is hardly conducive to us all getting along.
Yeah, no, definitely. Are there any specific aspects of the British Empire that you feel need to be explored more or analysed perhaps in a different perspective? And what direction would you suggest for, people interested or other historians kind of looking for a new area of research?
Well, I think one of the things that I mentioned before, this sort of, the culture war erupted, this ongoing tendency to have more scholars of colour and from more diverse backgrounds coming into the academy, that will continue to bring a different set of experiences, different interests, different questions asked, new sources uncovered. And the more that goes on, the better. For my own part, I think I've always been interested in this sort of juxtaposition of that vast geographical diversity of empire but also the way that at the same time it was interconnected through these networks of various kinds. So my own research has been on humanitarian missionary networks, settler networks, the way the different communities of British settlers corresponded and shared their political concerns in the 19th century, and governmental networks. My last sort of academic book was Ruling the World, it was called, and it was about how the British government tried to govern this enormously diverse entity everywhere all at once during certain moments of the 19th century and through these sort of various networks. For my own part, I'd like to move now more into the counter networks that brought about change, rather than looking at these sort of hegemonic ones of humanitarian settlers and government. The kind of transatlantic networks of enslaved people and networks of indigenous organisation. I started to look at that in a book called Indigenous Communities that I co-edited with some indigenous writers, talking about the way that their communities try to connect beyond the community globally to resist some of the forces that they're facing with settler dispossession. But there's whole bodies of scholarship and other scholars who've done this stuff, and I want to get more into that and examine the kind of global networks of activism and connection and rationalisation, some of them quite conservative, that try to engender a different form of empire, a different kind of empire. So I'm particularly interested in that. But, there should be a whole profusion of different trajectories taken through the imperial past. And the key thing is not to try and limit them, I think.
I just want to say thank you, because I've got through all the questions that I had planned. I just want to double check. Is there anything in particular that you think we should mention or we haven't included that you would like to just before we wrap up? Because I want to obviously make sure we include everything as much as we can, obviously.
Yeah. So I think, part of the problem with discussing empire is how emotionally invested people are in it. I was brought up as a white kid in a working class community with a real sense of pride in sort of white British history, in which black people were figured only as subjects of white colonial rule. And when you raised reading comics which are about Britain winning the Second World War and Britain running an empire, you kind of get emotionally invested in that group identity, and it becomes part of who you are. And it takes quite a lot of unlearning, to see things from different perspectives. And for me, it really took a trip to South Africa as an undergraduate during apartheid. Some black students took this kind of white Englishman who was visiting under their wing and showed me what life was like in the townships of South Africa towards the end of apartheid. And mind-blowing for me to see that this system, which was built on the foundations of British colonialism, could operate in these ways, and just seeing things like hospitals in the townships overflowing with cases spilling out onto stretchers in the car park and in the streets and so on. And then just down the road, a white hospital with all the latest state-of-the-art facilities and empty beds, and then visiting white schools and black schools and seeing sort of the violence that was promoted by the late apartheid state. It's provoking what they called black-on-black violence, assisting Zulu nationalists to attack ANC supporting youth in the townships where I was staying. All of that led me to become basically an academic and to research British colonial history, because I was interested in what role the British Empire played in laying these foundations for the post-1948 Afrikaner nationalist apartheid project. But anyway, it's just the long-winded way of saying that a lot of white Britons are invested in this view of the empire as an integral part of British identity. And when they see that sort of challenged, that's one of the reasons why I think it is easy for politicians and for right-wing pundits to mobilise a lot of support around empire as part of the culture war. But it's not just white Britons. You see a lot of nostalgia for empire in India. Some of my kind of most ferocious interlocutors on Twitter or X are Indians who look back very proudly on the Raj and won't hear it questioned. And that's a reflection of how diverse the impact of colonial rule was in India. That the East India Company and then the British Raj operated in collaboration with Indian elites, and they mobilised the caste system as a different form of class differentiation. And British rule benefited merchants, particularly urban merchants, for example, and many others, princely states and so on. So you've got this diversity of experience in a place like India, and still a lot of attachment to the empire in certain quarters. Similarly in Nigeria, where certain people were elevated to chiefly status to help the British with indirect rule. There's a lot of nostalgia for the kind of authority that certain groups were accorded relative to others. And in a place like Hong Kong now, despite British rule in Hong Kong being very selectively wealth-inducing, and despite the racism of British rule and the lack of democracy, in contrast with what's going on now, it's looked back as, through kind of rose-tinted nostalgic spectacles. So this, diversity of experience of empire, that's one of the reasons why I'm keen to examine it holistically and do my historical geography stuff. I was thinking about everywhere all at once, because otherwise the tendency is to extrapolate from one small experience. So you have some elite Indians telling me that because the Raj benefited their community, therefore the empire was good. And of course, the other 40 colonies, and for Aboriginal Australians just as much as First Nations, Canadians, and all Indians. So trying to look at it holistically, I think is an important thing to do, particularly if you're engaging in these kind of politically nuanced reflections on it. I think just one other thing that I thought about saying in response to one of your questions was about sort of how to approach some of these difficult conversations with people who take pride in a certain version of the past and don't like that being challenged, and they would often see it as a personal affront to them if you tell them that Britons in the past, who they see as their ancestors, not actually knowing whether they are part of their family genealogy or not, but if you tell them that Britons in the past did these horrendous things, and that's not something they've been confronted with in their schooling, it can come as a challenge, to be seen as a personal affront. And so, the way that we sort of manage these conversations, I think, is quite important, not just sort of hitting them over the head with the facts, but engaging in some kind of sort of negotiation. One example often occurs to me is to do with slavery. As we mentioned, small c conservatives as well as big C conservatives would far rather we talk about abolition and exaggerate Britain's role as the progenitor of abolition, when there had been many abolitions of slavery in many societies through history before the British abolition of its engagement in transatlantic slavery. But rather than just saying, well, actually, Britain took a quarter of all the people who were trafficked from Africa to the Americas, over 3 million, were a dominant slavery in the 18th century, and sort of just battering them with these facts and how horrendous conditions were for enslaved people. You can start to talk about, well, if we're proud of abolition, that means that we're taking pride in those who went against the grain. We're taking pride in campaigners, activists, the people who fought for abolition against vested interests, in collaboration with formerly enslaved people like Udai Equiano, who brought their experiences to bear. And this was a campaign. This was activism. This was wokery, in practice.
Yeah.
We're now looking back and saying that's the bit we're proud of. That's the bit of our history we're proud of. So, and similarly, in terms of domestic history, we talk about Britain being a democracy and spreading democracy through empire. Well, democracy only came about because of the activism of people like the Chartists. So, these groups that papers like the Mail and the Telegraph berate today as progressive activists, they're the groups that the very same people look back on as being the defining moment of our proud history. So, just having sort of conversations like that, I think, is one way to try and change opinions where you can, but it doesn't always work.
No, I think that's brilliant, and I love the way that you've approach those with that view, because actually highlighting what they're supporting just goes to show the paradox that they fall in by kind of following an agenda rather than where the source or where the history kind of takes you. It's really interesting, and this part I may cut out of the actual podcast, but it's really interesting having this because the same things that you say about people on the left or the right or wherever they fit on the political spectrum is exactly the same stuff you can apply to people who have a very particular religious disposition and they have a religious story of some, or they have a narrative they were told by someone or somewhere, and they're like, yep, that's the truth. And when you try to approach that with history, they just explode. So the parallels, as we've been discussing, and you've answered a lot of questions I had without me having to ask them directly. So extra thank you for that.
I mean, dogma is safe, isn't it? And having it challenged exposes you to threat in some way, I think.
Yeah. But what's interesting is in both instances, political or religious, with whatever dogma, their responses aren't based in dealing or actually working with the history or with the source or with the content. It's very much based on what I think this and I believe that. And I'm like, that's fine. You can believe it. It doesn't change what this source says.
Yeah.
And then it just becomes polemic, and then people are like, well, you're this and I'm like, cool, I'm out. I'm not I'm not here for that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks very much for doing this, and I appreciate the opportunity.
No,
not
a problem. I thank you for your time, and thank you again for a copy of the book. I haven't read it all, and I am meaning to read more of it. But I've definitely enjoyed what I read so far.
Right. Yeah. Well, your podcast series has been really interesting for me as well. I've been dipping in and out of it, and I'll continue to do so. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. No, thank you. It means a lot coming from professors and academics like yourself. I'm just some history nerd who never quite made it to professor level. So yeah,
a lot
thank
more
you so
than
much.
That's me.
All right, so that's the end of another podcast episode. I hope you guys enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed putting it together. If you want to support the work that I'm doing, then consider becoming a Patreon member or a YouTube member via the links in the description below. Otherwise than that, I just want to say thank you for making it this far to the end, and a quick shout out to our Patreon members. Also, a quick shout out to our YouTube members. Otherwise than that, thank you for tuning in. Hopefully I'll see you in the next podcast episode. Bye.